Welcome, welcome. We're glad to have everybody here for Cardea's Users Group meeting for August 11th. We meet under the umbrella of the Linux Foundation Public Health Organization. Therefore, we adhere to the Linux Foundation's antitrust policy. The entire policy is rather brief. It's about a page long, but it tells us not to discuss specific pricing or business opportunities to avoid entanglement with antitrust law. We also follow the Cardea Code of Conduct, which is that everyone has a voice and is encouraged to participate. If you're not comfortable speaking, you can type notes into the chat and those will be acknowledged. It also means to be nice to everyone. If you have problems with anything regarding the code of conduct or the meetings that are being held, please contact either Keela or myself. There are also email addresses that go to broader groups. If you have a problem with Keela or myself, then you can reach out to Linux Foundation Public Health to resolve any particular problems. We usually pause at the beginning of our meeting for anyone who wishes to introduce themselves. Is there anyone who would like to introduce themselves today? I recognize all of the people on the call, so if you don't want to reintroduce yourself, you don't have to. We're glad to have you all here. Today, we wanted to talk a little bit about consent and how to broaden what we've been doing with consent. We've previously considered consent in the context of sharing a vaccination or vaccination exemption or test result with between a healthcare organization and getting that to the end patient who can then share it with other parties. However, as we broaden out our use cases, our consent may need some deeper thought in how to manage consent and for things like clinical trials or workplace types of situations or with educational institutions. So these types of consent should be considered and try to make our consent schema relevant to a wide variety of use cases. So that is our topic for today. Keela, I know you've had a broad set of experiences with consent, particularly in the medical side of things. Would you like to kind of set the stage and give us a little background on consent and why that's important?
Sure, right after I let Sam in. Yeah, so as Ken mentioned, there's a variety of scenarios where consent would be required. In the United States, this also varies. So there's consent layers and various consent policies that might come into play. For example, oh, here, everybody's just got out of a meeting, I guess, and is joining us. Welcome to those of you who are getting on now. We've just started, and we're talking about consent as a concept in this community. So, for example, in some situations, there is what's called opt-out consent, meaning you're assumed to be in for certain use cases. There might be opt-in where you have to explicitly say yes in order for something to be able to happen. And some things that may be enabled by consent could include the sharing of consent or the access by organizations or participants to be able to see data. So consent has sort of different angles and different use cases in that sense. There are also, again, this is my frame of reference is US consent policy. And so I'd love to hear if anybody else has other country guidelines as well. There are certain data points that are considered additionally sensitive. So you may have sort of high-level consent regulation, but then there are some additional mandates when talking about these sensitive data areas. And those sensitive data areas can include substance use and detox data that is considered sensitive. Additional sensitivities may include the mental health data, as well as developmental disability data is also considered sensitive. We have a lot of conversation happening right now about reproductive data and its sensitivity and need for potential additional data privacy guidelines. HIV and STI, STD data can also be considered sensitive, although it's usually covered under those sort of higher level authorizations and doesn't require explicit special handling around redisclosure and things like that. Let me pause for a moment. There's also, before I pause, sorry, there's also the concept of HIPAA, regular HIPAA release. That's a little more nuanced than this concept of I authorize things to happen about me. Those are usually additional and explicit consents. Now I will pause and see if anybody wants to chime in, add something I may have missed, comment from another perspective.
I just had a question, Keela. Is the consent that we're talking about the same as the medical release stuff, or are we going to have two different pieces? They apply differently.
Well, that's what part of the conversation today, for sure, I think. So I don't know that we have the answer to that yet, but hopefully through today's discussion, we'll decide whether or not the medical release schema does encompass everything or whether we need to have an additional consent expanded schema.
Okay.
I do think there's one other that I missed, I apologize, is what's called level. So there's level 1 consent and level 2 consent. Level 2 consent is what's required for research.
What's level 1?
It's a great question. I need to look up the definition because I don't know that I could articulate it.
Level 2 is for medical research.
Yes.
Am I assuming that the consent provided would need to be retained for like requirement reasons? Like it's got to be retained for a certain period of time or as long as you have the data or something?
Yes, and very often because consent controls access to information, it's kind of, as I would describe it, as one of the most important data points. It also needs often to be audited, and that's why it needs to also be kept. It's the key that unlocks things and therefore is really critical to verify from a quality perspective.
And to Keela's point, from a legal perspective, consent that's the gateway. That is kind of the trigger of what you can and can't do with information and, consent at collection, consent when you expand the scope of use of data. And then, of course, destruction or deletion of data applies in some jurisdictions. All of that hinges on consent, including use of the data, how it's used.
How should we capture the idea of deletion? How is the deletion? I didn't follow that completely.
Christy, do you want to expand on that?
Yeah, so I guess there's kind of notice and consent. And so some of these features that you have listed there, Keela, about opt-in consent. So when someone decides they've consented at some point, and then later on they opt out. There's also in some jurisdictions, specifically Europe, GDRP, I think California, but I need to double check, where rather than they discontinue their consent, they end their consent, and they may also ask for records to be deleted. I can't remember if it was on within this group that we had a conversation about deletion and how some things just you can't delete some things. So to what extent do you go to accomplish that deletion requirement? And we could have more, further conversation about that. But I know that that's something that needs to be considered. As far as functionality, that I'm not sure. I need to review the laws to see to what extent you have to go.
So I have a thought to throw in here. So if we think about where the medical data is stored, obviously it's stored at the source, the place where it originated from, and it will be stored in the wallet of the holder, right, on their phone app. But then does it actually need to be stored anywhere else as it relates to our stuff? Because we don't necessarily, like a government agent, a primary verifier doesn't need to store the data. They just need to know that you have it, right? And therefore we don't have to worry about the deletion part in terms of how it would affect primary verifiers. Question?
I think sometimes the verifier only needs to, view it once and they're done. In other cases, you're actually sharing the medical data with them and they're storing it. So I think that you're right to point out the distinction between the two cases, but I think that both cases exist.
Yeah, there certainly would be use cases where the verifier needs to maintain data for some use case or period of time, or and so they actually do bring it in. That would
For
be part of the.
example,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, for example, Aruba was a primary verifier, but as a government, they have laws that mandate the storage of the data regarding the people who are coming into the country, at least for a certain amount of time. So that's just an example of a case where a primary verifier is mandated to store it, whereas in other cases, like what Steve was saying, they just need to know you have it.
Agreed. There are, so I think that the idea of the shred policy is an interesting concept. There's a lot of discussion happening about this today, right? The idea that people are moving their data electronically around and allowing its ingestion by others is still relatively new in the healthcare space. So the idea that that data may have to be removed from those downstream systems, I think is still a pretty new conversation. I know, at least in the spaces that I've been in, the idea is that once they have it, once they've ingested it, that whatever that downstream system is, it's now part of their record. You agreed for it to go there, whatever processes existed that allowed it to get to that place, it's now part of that record and does not need to be, sort of the chain of command of what happens with that data. I think we had this conversation a little bit in a slightly different vein last week, Christy. Sort of where do you stop having control? Do you ever stop having control? And where is that line of like, okay, well, now it's yours and you're responsible for it?
Right. And that really is the question. So one of my goals is to track data rights through the entire data life cycle, because all of that part I think is still pretty ambiguous.
So
Agreed.
I think another topic is the distinction between data itself being transferred or access to data. And
Yes.
there are two different kind of sides to that coin. One, you've given it to them, they have it, they can use it. And in another case, you haven't moved the data, you just have said, you can go look at my MRI images. I didn't actually transfer the data to the holder, I didn't transfer it to the verifier, I've just granted access, and it may be permanent, it may be temporary.
Yes, that is an important distinction.
Okay, another one that I want to call out, just to sort of let's put it all out on the table, considerations around consent, is the idea that in some use cases, consent and communication of data may be authorized between two parties. Yes, you can set, you can talk to my whatever. I'm working in a use case of early intervention. Actually, it was very interesting. There was a whole conversation about early intervention on the radio the other day, where early intervention happens before they go to school, right? Like really early age. I think the NPR was talking about it in the vein of autism. And the earlier you start services, the more likely that that person can develop social skills and be slightly more functioning depending on the range of their autism. So the idea is that those have to happen very early in their care. There is then a communication often between early intervention specialists and, for example, childcare that has to be authorized, that we then may say the early intervention specialist can talk to the school, because once they become school age, that care gets transitioned to the school district. And so those are specific relational consents. So for example, if Ken and I, just because we're on camera, we're going to talk about a patient, perhaps the patient authorizes me to share my medical data about this patient with Ken. And so that consent is directional and between two parties. There's also the concept that a patient can consent to a larger community. So for example, in these national exchange models, perhaps the patient could say, I'm opting in to participate in this national exchange. So anybody who wants to see my data because they're my, a treating provider can do that. I'm authorizing blanket statement this concept. And it doesn't matter specifically who you are. I don't have to authorize beyond that point. Both of those models exist on the ground today and are considerations for what this may need to support.
So kind of in a taking this broad set of concepts and things and trying to bring it into Cardea, right now the issuers of credentials are currently organizations. When a consent is given or granted, who is the signer and who is the issuer of that type of credential, or should it be embodied in a credential? How is the consent record need to be represented? Entertain some suggestions and thoughts on that.
So if we boil it down to the scope and our trust triangle and what we're trying to navigate, while those are the concepts that exist sort of globally, if I were to just rephrase that, Ken, we're saying what needs to exist between the holder and the issuer to facilitate activity, or is this a slightly different question?
So I'm trying to figure out how is consent represented? Is it represented in a credential? Is it represented in a text message? Is it represented in an answer to a Q&A protocol that says, do you give your consent? And I say, yes. Sam, I would like to get some of your thoughts on representations of consent from a user.
Oh my gosh. So I'm trying to figure out the right level of verbosity to inflict upon you. There is a huge amount of work gone into what's referred to as object capabilities, or OCAPs, that are a mechanism for granting access to things. And so the alignment between consent and granting access here drug my mind immediately in that direction. There are, of course, vigorous debates about the right way to do that, including whether a credential is in fact the right format of it or not. The reality is that if you want it to be auditable in a meaningful way, it would be really helpful if you can actually verify the audit lines themselves without having to go to additional parties, which means that you need something signed by the person giving authorization that says exactly what they're giving authorization for and to who. And if you can do that, then that represents both their consent for it to happen but that signed thing can also be given to the data holder, to the resource to actually access the data. Say, see, you should give this to me because the subject of that data says that I should have access to it, and that's useful. But now the thing we sign looks an awful lot like a credential, and typically we don't have individuals issue credentials. It's not impossible, but it's not something we typically do. It also has to be something that can be independently verifiable, which means we can't use a zero knowledge proof for this. This needs to be something like a JSON LD credential. It doesn't strictly have to be a credential, but if we're going to put a bunch of stuff in JSON and sign it, then it sort of makes sense that we would use a similar format. And so this is a little bit deep in that sense, but you're going absolutely the right direction, and enumerating the requirements as applies to medical is incredibly useful in trying to evaluate suggestions on how to technically solve this problem. How's that for level of verbosity?
I think it's not completely there yet, but I think it's going the right direction. What I'm trying to do is enumerate both the requirements and the potential mechanisms for solving it. I think the fact that you're indicating that it's something that needs to be signed by the person introduces an extra challenge to the system that we have not addressed to this point, and then it needs to be held by perhaps the person who issued it and also the person that was issued to. Is another challenge that makes this a little bit awkward and a difficult subject to deal with. And so I think you're going the right direction. We may need to poke even deeper. And Mike?
So either they have to sign it, or there has to be a trustworthy process whereby another party can sign it for them. So like if you had the issuer of some sort of credential like that, ask them a question with the question and answer protocol, and then they were able to store the answer and then sign the credentials for the individual. You know, if something like that were to hold up, you know, where you delegate the responsibility to issue.
Right. So this could be a notary, right? And the roles of a notary in here is actually incredibly useful in the cases where you might have a medical office that is willing to maintain a record of consent for a specific thing for a patient. They are actually signing the thing that can then be passed around as appropriate, and then the audit trail is still there, but the audit trail more or less ends in the record kept by the notary that process X, Y, and Z was done. And so whatever we do, that's likely going to be a requirement simply to serve the under technologified in this process. And so that's a really useful mechanism, but it luckily uses some of the same mechanisms that we're talking about for the other stuff. To be clear, Ken, I'm like 67% sure that the person giving consent should sign it. There are, in the general case, there are reasons why it might not be a good idea. And it introduces a handful of challenges, including how in the heck do you handle revocation for a air quote credential issued by an individual? That's like super fun discussion points about this. But these are some of the beginning things. What it would be great to figure out is if we can identify a portion of the cat that we can skin, recognizing that we're not going all the way, but be able to make some progress on this without having to solve the entire problem, as the entire problem is quite large.
I think that you introduced a new word that I'd never heard before as well, under technologified.
It's an adjective.
Oh, okay. So, but I think that that's an important consideration as well. I think that even if we don't solve it for all people, even if we solve it for the people who are technologified, that we're stepping in the right direction. I think we do need to consider people who don't have full access to technology as part of this, but and having a signature or a notarization of a signature by a trusted party, I think starts to move us in the right direction to have something that is both auditable and independently verified. That's another aspect of this that is important. Whether you're granting access to data or transferring data, I think is slightly less of a problem because you can have the user sit in the middle of that transaction. Providing access to the data, you're now opening the door to the data to somebody who may who should be authorized to be able to gain that access. And then the broad sharing of the data to a wider community is kind of at the other end of the spectrum, right? Where it's open to a broad set of people authorized to access data. But currently we only have supported a non-creds type credentials issued by typically organizations in Cardea. We don't have a mechanism in place right now for the signing of data by an individual, a patient. So that's a consideration that takes us kind of into a new area. And I think it may be interesting to explore whether, Sam, as you talked about, having the person sign something, even if they don't have a public DID, if they sign it with the relationship DID that they had with the organization that notarizes it, it is at least some auditable, traceable mechanism for proving that the person signed it, and that might be a helpful thing in moving towards a JSON LD or some other simpler mechanism that doesn't require the person to be present to present the the credential. It turns more into something that can be transferred or viewed or used independently of the patient being there for every single transaction.
Well, and it provides the audit capability that's necessary as well.
Yeah, all of that, those are all important considerations for my use case, and the requirement, as you described it, Ken, that matches my use case. That would be very necessary.
I would just make one recommendation, and then Mike, sorry, you can comment, that we don't use the word notarize, that we talk about a custodian of the consent, because notarization has a very specific definition and bar, and you have to be a notary to notarize something, and that's not the degree at which this is going to be managed. So custodian or guardian or consent navigator.
I've been in my thinking as I'm following this conversation, I'm just calling it the third party.
Yeah.
Maybe that's too ambiguous, but I like custodian.
It's sort of the technical custodian of that consent record. Mike, to your question or comment?
So first is a comment and then a question. So comment is, after this conversation, I'm looking at the way we are handling our medical release, and it's actually functioning more as a demographic recognition system, an identity proofing system at the moment, where they request self-attested demographic variables, and then they look you up and prove that you're the right person, and then they give you credentials so you don't have to do it again the next time. But it's not functioning as a full-blown consent system. It's mostly just demographics at the moment. Question is for Sam. Our work on attachments and governance to include chained or layered credentials is probably going to play a big role in addressing some of these consent processes. Does that sound right?
It does, as long as you're granting consent about the credential that you're also presenting. So if I have a credential that I'm presenting and I need to grant you permission to do something, then a supplement in the way that we've been discussing is very applicable. If you're granting access to a remote resource, it's a little bit less so.
Yeah. Okay.
I had a little trouble following that bit because I'm not as familiar with it, which means that there's probably other people on the call who are not as familiar as well.
Do you want a little background?
Can you give a little background on that?
I can. So we have protocols for presenting credentials. And those are useful, but sometimes there's additional information about the credential that you need to pass that is not contained inside the credential. A good example might be a credential about the issuer, or a consent receipt is actually, now that I think about it, that's a whole nother thing. There's a consent receipt architecture that comes out of Europe that you might need to pass consent for the use of the data that you're presenting in the credential alongside of it. And the idea here is, and we've had these concepts kind of dinging around for a little while. There's a handful of other cases unrelated to consent, like proof of hardware key ownership, in the sense that you can prove that a credential is being presented from the same hardware device that it was originally issued to for high security use cases. Anyway, these are all things that you need to say about a credential that are not necessarily contained in the credential. And so we've been working on a standardized way to do so, and pass that information as what we call a supplement to a credential. And that can make the workflow fairly streamlined. And of course, you could have a different, more complicated scenario where you have to go like ask various parties for things. But in the condition where that information is known at the type of issuance or is generated by the holder, they could just be provided during the exact same credential exchange protocol, which can streamline the process while still providing the necessary data. Is that helpful?
Yes.
And that's like in process. Like I literally need to go write later today an update to a PR that's to an Ares RFC. But it's been under discussion the last 2 weeks in the Ares working group for it to good effect.
Thank you. That's helpful to help that with that distinction. Currently, the medical release that we have as a schema type within Cardea is kind of narrow in scope. And I don't think that we should try to use that particular schema as our basis for how we want to go forward with consent. I do think we want to try to tackle the consent in a more generic way. And have we outlined all of the requirements sufficiently, or is there more to dig into here as we look at how consent is currently used? Do we need to poke at Europe a little bit more, or Asia for how they manage consent, or is looking at the US model an adequate starting point?
What people generally do is start with the GDPR model in the European Union, because at this point, and probably going forward in the near future, if you can comply with that level of consent, then you'll probably be able to comply in all other jurisdictions or countries or states.
Should we, I'm so sorry, I missed a couple minutes there at a call, but should we try and consider like a minimum acceptable phase one? If GDPR is like the utopian standard that we would like to eventually be at, is there something short of that that we could do that would still give us some value?
I think we would need to dive into the GDPR details to answer that. What's like a stepping stone to get to full GDPR? But in theory, yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Mike.
I was just going to say GDPR almost represents the minimum, not the utopian.
Yeah, I was going to say GDPR is the smallest of our large pile of issues.
Do we have anybody on the line with us today that can give us the high level synopsis of how GDPR consent is functioning or should function?
Are you talking from a technical standpoint?
Let's
From
start
a
from legal.
governance, yeah, from a generic how it governs
it's not
consent.
it's not easy to summarize, but the EU has done a very good job of explaining it. So if you actually go to the EU site and look at the various different provisions, it does provide a very comprehensive and yet a non-legalese explanation.
Yes.
But I can't remember any of those off the top of my head.
I do think the bare minimums are just what we've talked about here, that there has to be opt-in, opt-out, consent, destruction, deletion. Those are kind of the high
Yeah.
points.
Data minimization,
Mhm,
privacy by design, things like
mhm.
I'm-
Access to your data and the right to be forgotten are two rights enumerated in the GDPR.
I think it might be useful to invite either Paul Knowles or Jan. What's Jan's last name? Remember? They both had spent a fair amount of time trying to work on
Jan
consent.
Lindquist.
Jan Lindquist, yeah.
There's also an Aries RFC called Data Consent Lifecycle that by those authors, by Paul and Jan.
So Jan,
Jan. I think it's Swedish. Lindquist, Lindq.
I know that one,
Yeah. Good
mostly
job.
because of the Rangers.
Yeah, I think that those might be good. Do you know what the name of the RFC was?
It's RFC 167, Data Consent Lifecycle, and I'll drop a link in the chat. If I can find the chat. I found the chat.
And I'm looking for, I know I have a good, simple summary compliance document from a company called OneTrust. But the link you have to register with an email. So I'll see if I have like the PDF that I can send along.
So the consent for GDPR in the link that I shared it's like 5 bullets. It's not significantly complicated in terms of just the strictly consent. It says consent must be freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous. Requests for consent must be clearly distinguishable from other matters and present in clear and plain language. It's pretty standard. Data subjects can withdraw previously given consent whenever they want, and you have to honor their decision. You can't simply change the legal basis of the processing to one of the other justifications, excuse me. Children under 13 can only give consent with permission from their parent. That's certainly a nuance because the age at which people can legally sign things is probably different. And you need to keep documentary evidence of consent.
Mike.
So looking at what we're doing with Cardea and maybe proposing a place to start, the basic idea is that under GDPR, people have right to access to, and under various US healthcare laws as well, have right to access their healthcare data. And so as soon as the issuers of medical data can identify a person, then they have the right to receive their data. So we have a little bit of demographic work to do, and then issue health credentials as we've been doing. That's pretty straightforward from the laws that are applicable. I think that the challenge legally that we're going to face is how to allow people down the chain who are going to receive that medical data. How do we help them be able to prove that they have the right to be using that data that the person handed to them after they presented a credential, and then the person presents a credential and then does whatever they're going to do, and then they leave, and then later on that the institution or organization that received that data has to be able to prove that the person consented to their use of it. And so maybe our very first step would be we need a consent custodian that can hand out something like a JSON LD credential along with the presentations of medical credentials, so that the person can hand their data to people, and then using, partnering with this consent custodian, they can, hand over something that they can use to prove consent. And say, here's a JSON LD credential, and now you have an auditable record that shows that I consented to you having this data, if you're going to store it beyond just the initial presentation or something like that. So that seems like maybe a place to start. If you have a consent custodian and a revocable credential that you can use to prove that you have the right to use it, the consent given from the patient, that might be, is that a good place to start? Is it too big, or is it not adequately addressing the problem? But that's just kind of where my brain went to say, what are we doing right now, and how do we enable consent in that flow?
To me, that's a really good place to start. I say that just based on my experience working with other developers trying to build out what I've been trying to build for the last several years. And that is, I think, the lowest common denominator.
Are there other issues or topics around consent that we've missed? What else is missing? What have we missed?
I would say, Ken, consent is a huge issue, and I think it's going to come up in multiple ways. And I prefer to focus on Cardea and the use cases we're talking about here. But for example, outside the scope of this conversation, for the use cases I consider, multiple consent simultaneously will be important, because I would have an athlete who could consent to the use or sharing of information, an agent for that athlete, an actual agent, not just the term an agent, but a sports agent who represents that athlete, who could offer consent on behalf of the athlete. The players' union would be offering consent, and the data collection party, which would actually be the verifier, I guess they're not offering consent, but I could also have a team, a league, and a content creator simultaneously all having to give some type of consent, or they might wear different titles or hats depending on the data that's shared and for the purpose, maybe based on how it's collected. So there's a lot of, and then like I mentioned before, the different jurisdictions and the consent rules in each jurisdiction, and then the governance within each organization as to how they're going to deal with consent. So I think it's a many-headed monster. There's a lot of nuance and complexity that would need to be addressed, but I do think we've addressed the lowest common denominators.
Yeah, I think that as we start with the patient, then we move into guardianship, like either parental or senior care or things like that. And then you can move into legal representatives that act on behalf of a particular patient, like the sports agent or a team that has legal authority to. The circle can expand out, but I think that we need to make sure that we're considering that it's not just the patient. It may be other signers of consent, and how to accommodate that.
So the work that Sam was talking about presenting a credential with some other stuff along with it, the stuff along with it would allow you to, you could pass along potentially one or more related, provable statements. So you could do layered or multi-party consent, but the core of the issue, that credential at the bottom that says that this person has given their consent, and individuals are not acting as issuers, and so needing a consent custodian, basically we need an issuer of a transferable credential format like JSON-LD. We need a new party to be able to issue those credentials on behalf of the individual so that they can hand them out to people who they're giving their consent to down the chain and at that very base level. And then as those capabilities to present data along with the credential grow, then you can add heads to the monster to say who is giving consent or allowing this credential to be issued, this consent credential to be issued. So if we start at the bottom, it feels to me like that's handles the fundamental framework, and then you can grow the governance monster as you need to.
Can I just make sure I'm following that concept? Because obviously that's new to this conversation.
Yes. It's new to everybody. We're still working it out in the community.
Okay, so in concept, when I start to think, how would that apply to this use case? What comes to my mind is if we just use Christie's example to facilitate the discussion, right? An agent, like a sports agent, has a contract with a person, an athlete. You could also, just on another example, a health plan is the covering agency for a patient, right? Same concept. They have like some kind of contractual relationship with each other where they can do things on their behalf of whatever they've been authorized. So the sports agent might have that contract credential that says I'm legally authorized to do stuff on behalf of my athlete, or the health plan might say because I'm their health plan, I'm required and or allowed to do things. And so they would present that in addition to them being the agent, now lowercase a agent, of the patient saying, I authorize this thing to happen. So they would provide both the thing that says, yes, I want you to do this. And by the way, here's my authority. That's whatever that is, contract, relationship, whatever, with that. So it's like a 1-2 punch of credentials, and the pairing of them is what says we're good to go here. Did I conceptually understand?
Yes, from Christy.
But Mike and Sam from this credential thing that I don't know what it's called yet.
Credential supplements, and yes, I think so.
Yeah.
Okay.
Someone has a better name, we're all ears, but supplements is the least offensive one we've come up with so far.
Yeah, it's sort of like chaining. It's chaining credentials together to allow them to.
So chain credentials are one of the uses of supplements. There are others.
Okay. And but conceptually, the idea that it's like, because I have this thing, now this other thing can be analyzed and make sense in the context. That's kind of the goal.
Yes, it is context for the evaluation of a credential. Context for the, maybe I'd say use, not just evaluation. Meaning if you're providing consent for the use of the data alongside the data that you're actually providing, that way you're outlining like, hey, I'm giving this to you, but here's the reason I'm giving this to you. Then yeah, that's exactly what it's for. And
Okay,
that could be retained, and there's nothing like there's nothing about that bothers the concept.
Okay, another use case for that could be, here's the referral for services, and here's the information that you care about because I'm sending you this referral. Like I'm referring you to an ophthalmologist, and here's the things that ophthalmologist you need to know because I've told my patient to go to you.
Yes.
Okay.
And that information could actually be provided originally by the ophthalmologist, right? They give you the referral and
That's
they say,
correct.
Here's other information they're going to, in addition to actually knowing that the referral is authorized and from who, like me, the doctor, here's other information that they're going to need to know when you get there. And that's a good use for that.
Okay, we definitely need pictures because this is getting complicated. And I actually, you know what? I like cooked up this really crazy consent idea in my spare time, and I can't open my PowerPoint of pictures. So we'll have to talk about that another day. It's
Do you
like,
have consent for it?
I hope so.
I think
PowerPoint
I think
clearly doesn't
PowerPoint
think
removed
so.
consent. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. So there's a lot. I think we
One other
have.
question.
Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. One other comment. I can't wait to see your pictures. I do want to see that. Also, I have developed slides with Scott Harris a few months ago that shows kind of this many-headed consent. It's a very simple version, but to the extent that's helpful, we could utilize that.
Christy, I think if you want to review those and remove whatever might be sensitive to you, if we could look at a desensitized version, that would certainly be valuable to this conversation, because right now we're trying to have it without the use of any visual aids, and it's maybe abstract for some of us.
Okay, yeah, I'll see if I can take out some of the take out all the confidential information and send that along. Should I just send that to you, Keela, to distribute?
Sure. We can walk through it at one of our next meetings to talk through
Okay.
this.
All
This
right,
is certainly
thanks.
not our only conversation about this. We're going to need quite a few, it seems like.
This is a complicated subject. I appreciate everybody's input on helping to both tease out the requirements and what are some of the technical challenges that we will face. What are some of the legal hurdles that we face in trying to make consent more user-friendly and organization-friendly as well, so that they can meet their legal requirements to protect the rights of the individuals who are involved. Are there other comments or topics that we should add to our agendas for upcoming meetings?
Yes.
We
And
still
we
have the-
mentioned it. Revocation.
Yes, revocation and
mentioned
expiration
revocation.
date.
And we really need to figure out how that gets executed and honored in these frameworks.
Vadim, I didn't hear your comment. Could you repeat it?
Expiration date. So this is kind of complementary to expiration to revocation.
Yes. Okay.
We,
Thank you.
we also still need to tackle the demography problem, how to do demographics.
Could you elaborate a little? What do you mean, the problem?
So when you go to, as a medical institution, someone's asking for their health records, it's important to prove who that person is, that you're confident that you know who that person is before you hand them sensitive data. And there are various ways to do that that have different levels of assurance that that's accurate data about the person. So if you ask them questions and they fill out the forms themselves and submit that, you know, if they're standing there in the office and they have a driver's license with them to submit along with their self-provided, you know, form, then you have reasonable assurance that you know who it is. In a digital case where you may not be seeing the person visually or whatever, you know, are we going to require additional proof of who they are? What does that process look like? You know, how is that? Because, for example, Liquid Avatar is using a liveness check and a driver's license or a passport to fill out the information that goes into what is currently called a medical release credential. Whereas for demonstration purposes, some of the other agents in Cardea are just asking for self-attested fields, and people fill it out, and you know, it could be anybody as long as they know the right information. So, you know, there's what fields to collect and how to prove that they're accurate is a question that's not been settled.
Other topics that need to be addressed. Thanks for that explanation, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's a good list of future topics. Next week is a business level discussion, so we'll get a topic on the agenda for next week and look forward to seeing you all at that meeting. I think we have a few minutes left, but I'm okay with letting the meeting go under once instead of over 16 times. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everybody.
Till next
Keela.
time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to just put a note or send a couple sentences over to Rob at LFPH for their weekly project update. So I'm going to say Cardea discussed guardianship as it relates to health data and created a list of what? What is this list? This is a list of like
We discussed consent and the list
consent.
of challenges with consent. That's it.
Challenges. Okay.
For designing consent schemas.
Okay.
Schemas,
Yeah.
maybe with an S.
Consent requirements.
List
Thanks for
of
sending that over to LFPH.
challenges and requirements. Okay.
Mhm.
When it comes to designing consent schemas. Okay.